Tet Offensive. A week-long truce in celebration of the Chinese New Year meant fighting had ceased momentarily. This also meant that many families held funerals for family members lost to the war. But many of the coffins did not contain bodies but rather weapons that were used by the Viet Cong to attack hundreds of surrounding villages. U.S. soldiers were criticized and blamed for being hugely unprepared for the attack. With Johnson withdraws. By this time, many U.S. citizens begin to disapprove of the war, and many anti-war coalitions appear prominently in the Democratic Party. Eugene McCarthy promises to run against President Johnson and claims to stop all involvement in Vietnam. Protests begin to sweep the nation. With the recent assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, two major figures in the civil rights movement, many violent and non-violent protests begin. Alternatively, over 40,000 students across the nation protest involvement in Vietnam. Chaos in Chicago. Chicago is quickly swept with protests in civil rights and anti-war. Eventually, the governor of Chicago sends 12,000 police units and riot control on the protesters, turning battle of police versus protesters. Vietnamization. With the presidential election of 1968, Nixon wins and announces the first wave of troop removal from Vietnam. Withdrawal from Vietnam. A gradual withdrawal begins in 1969 with the first 25,000 troops removed from Vietnam, and within the next 3 years, troops in Vietnam dropped from 500,000 to less than 25,000. Peace with honor. After the withdrawal, Nixon begins to order a massive bombing run through popular supply routes used by the Viet Cong agents. This act was in order to make the Vietnamese think he was capable of anything. Violence on campus. Protests begin to break out across the nation, but the most famous of these riots were the Kent State University protests. The police handled this protest by calling in the National Guard and having live ammunition fired into the crowd of students. Pentagon Papers. In 1969, a 7,000-page document was leaked with drawn plans of war from 1945 to 1967, as Johnson claimed not to send troops to Vietnam. This document sent the U.S. in heavy distrust with its government. After veterans come home. After a long, hard-fought losing battle by the U.S. soldiers, their return home was generally regarded as a cold hand. Soldiers did not get their typical big welcome home party from the generations past, and many soldiers were looked down upon and spit on by the general public. End of war. After the removal of U.S. troops, eventually South Asia falls to a large-scale attack and only gets economic aid from the U.S., but refuses to send troops, thus ending the Vietnam War. With the total U.S. casualties racking up to 58,000 Americans killed and 303,000 wounded, U.S. citizens have a more cynical look on the government. Legacy of Vietnam. Even 44 years after the war ended, Vietnam remains the subject of great controversy and is still debated about today. One act that resulted from Nixon's presidency was the War Powers Act. The president must notify Congress when sending troops. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is a 2-acre U.S. national memorial in Washington, D.C.